You're watching Street Legends, raw stories about real ones. From Compton to Brooklyn, from Kendrick to Tupac, we break down the lives behind the legacy. Introduction. Kendrick Lamar sat back in a black leather chair, pages of a 1969 Ebony magazine spread open in his hands. An article about the search for a Black Christ. The sun outside Milk Studios burned through the glass like a spotlight from heaven. Los Angeles in all its brightness. And Kendrick right there in the middle of it. His hair freshly twisted, gray sweats hugging him like armor. He looked calm but focused, reading words older than his own 27 years. Someone from the TDE crew switched the playlist. Off went Miles Davis and Duke Ellington. In came Young Thug. The shift changed the room's energy. Kendrick rose, 5'5" of intensity, started moving his hands like he was already mid-performance, and the cameras loved it. By then, he was already past To Pimp a Butterfly. Reporters were still catching up, writing about Coltrane and Funkadelic like that explained him. It didn't. What he had in his head was bigger, something spiritual, ancestral, unchained. When I met him later that night at UMG's Iovine studio, he was still in that same designer suit. Never returned it. Maybe never planned to. I'd spent days preparing, looping Good Kid, m.A.A.d City, streaming old MTV interviews, running To Pimp a Butterfly non-stop on my phone. All right, wasn't an anthem yet. Not in the streets. But it already felt like prophecy. When we finally talked, he was grounded, almost quiet, like every word had to earn its way out. He spoke about trust, about how men are taught to hide what's soft. My father taught me everything good, he said. But one thing wrong, that I can't open up to him emotionally. You grow up thinking feelings make you weak, especially around another man. He paused, eyes heavy but steady. Most men go to women for that. I still gotta figure it out. 3 months earlier, he'd proposed to Whitney Alford, his high school love. He was learning trust, piece by piece. Later, the conversation drifted to South Africa, his first trip to the continent. He said it hit him like a memory he didn't know he had. It felt like home, he said. That's why I named one track Mama. We grow up seeing the bad side of Africa, poverty, struggle, but nobody shows us how beautiful it is. Those kids I saw, they had nothing, but they smiled like they'd live forever. Back in the States, the streets were different. Fame had already started to weigh on him, but he carried it like a man used to gravity. To Pimp a Butterfly wasn't just a record. It was a confession, a gospel, a therapy session he let the world listen to. Songs like You ripped through depression and self-hate. For Free flipped jazz into protest. Kendrick was breaking form, bending rules, channeling spirits. He told me one of his producers once said, "You're already a jazz musician and don't even know it." He laughed at that. Guess that's just my ancestors talking. I was always around older folks, old souls. I acted older than my age. When I was 9, I was playing ball with 16-year-olds. Even as a kid, he watched Bruce Lee flicks and Dolomite movies, blending East with West, street with philosophy. By that point, everyone wanted to talk about the Control verse, his lyrical kill list that flipped hip-hop upside down. But his camp had banned it. He'd moved on. The world just hadn't caught up. He didn't chase the noise, he escaped it. When I asked how he stayed centered, he said, "You gotta turn everything off. Sit in silence. Think about what you've done, what you've built. In this life, everything moves so fast you forget to be grateful." Then the tone shifted. Faith entered the room. "I got baptized a few years back," he said. "Got saved in a parking lot. Life tested that faith. I had to believe God was real for me, not just as a word, but in my heart. I can't run from that. I'll keep putting it in my music because if I didn't, it wouldn't be real. When I left that night, he stayed behind, still working. Always working. Maybe on Damn, maybe on a verse for someone else. It didn't matter. That's who he was, the man who never clocked out. Years later, people would talk about Pulitzer Prizes and Obama's playlists. But back then, he was just a kid from Compton who carried the weight of history like it was part of his DNA. A generation's voice. A poet with battle scars. A man baptized by the streets and saved by the mic. That's Kendrick Lamar, a street legend in real time. Chapter 1. Ronald Reagan era. They were babies of the Reagan years, scattered across a southern campus that smelled like pine sap and hair grease. Pledging letters they barely understood and futures they prayed would show up on time. Up the hill, past Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, the grass wore Greek scars. A concrete A set in the dirt. A brick horseshoe the color of dried blood. Pink and green paint riding an old oak like a flag nobody dared pull down. Freshmen poured out of the administration building with purple beanies clipped to high-top fades, mushroom bobs, asymmetrical perms. Youth stitched together by style and student loans. Two of them drifted from the crowd and slipped toward the lot, chasing shade and a little quiet. Her Sentra was red and loud, even when the engine was off. She slid in first, 5 years older, sweet-faced and soft-spoken, until the cassette clicked. Easy does it. The car filled with curl activator in California. He was 17, long and skinny, cheeks mapped by old acne, swaggering on a budget and pretending he wasn't outclassed. New York in his ears had taught him to sneer at anything west of Jersey. The moment the Compton wine hit, he rolled his eyes, and she smiled like a teacher who's heard the wrong answer 100 times. Then she turned the volume up. Outside, Atlanta sweltered. Inside, the West Coast announced it had arrived. Year was 1988, Morris Brown College. On the 9th floor of Borders Tower, doors shook after midnight. Too Short bled into Ice-T, J.J. Fad collapsed into NWA, and weed slipped out from under thresholds like fog. The East Coast kids threw Public Enemy and Rakim like punches, all clipped drums and sharpened politics. James Brown breaks and 5%er lessons heat sealed into a militant strut. The West answered with a lean, a low ride, a different math of menace. Arguments sprang up wherever a boombox did. Whose world? Whose rules? In the Bronx, they thought they invented forever. In Atlanta, they learned forever had cousins. Back then, the TV did missionary work. Fab Five. Freddie beamed Yo, MTV raps into suburbia, baptized goth kids and valedictorians alike, leveled the country's dialects into one long chorus. Ice Cube crossed the map to borrow Public Enemy's Bomb Squad for America's Most Wanted, proving the coasts weren't borders so much as mirrors. Some still picked sides out of habit. The kid in the Sentra picked wrong and didn't know it yet. A few years later, trapped on a tiny 59 in a clown car of frat boys running the Chronic on repeat, he tried to hold the line. George Clinton is the only genius here, he argued. Everything else is theft. Then somewhere in Tennessee, the bass rewired his spine and he stopped fighting. What killed his politics wasn't apathy. It was swing. Dre's drums moved like a city, and cities win. America, meanwhile, kept setting itself on fire and calling it law. April '92. Rodney King verdict hits like a hammer through the TV glass. In Atlanta, the liquor store near campus burned until the sky looked bruised. In Los Angeles, the anger learned to run. A stranger in a sedan rolled down her window, pleaded through a cracked voice, "This isn't the way," and sped off. Fear buckled in the passenger seat. By May 4th, the stats were body counts and property lines. Thousands arrested, dozens dead, neighborhoods turned to cinder. You didn't need hindsight to decode the story. It was close captioned in smoke. 94 and 95 became a theater with no exit sign. A white Bronco crawled the freeway while a nation held its breath. Court TV made ritual out of tragedy, and living rooms scheduled their grief. Hip-hop scored the whole mess. Dre, Snoop, Cube, Pac. California didn't just soundtrack the decade, it choreographed it. The movies helped carry the myth. Boys in the Hood gave Ice Cube a new mask. Juice crowned Tupac with menace and charisma. In the background, The Chronic still spun at house parties like a second sun. G-Thang slipping from barbecue smoke to bedroom walls, synths bending time into neon. Picture a powder blue house on 137th Street. A little boy with a big head dancing clumsy past bedtime, while grown folks two-step, the speakers bragging and laughing at the same time. 20 minutes away, Death Row shuts down the Slauson swap meet to film the California Love remix. A father hoists his 8-year-old onto his shoulders so the kid can see legends up close. The boy stares like he's finally met the future. That kid is Kendrick. The year's 1995. The city names him before he names himself. His parents had already paid the toll. Paula and Kenny left Chicago with $500 and 2 trash bags for luggage, rode the rails to San Bernardino, then slid into Compton on a prayer and a favor. Motels, store shifts, hustles that left no receipts. Section 8 paperwork next to fry grease burns. When their son arrived in June of '87, they christened him with a singer's legacy, Kendrick's without the S, and drove him home to Big Daddy Kane on the stereo. Compton raised him on block noise and church whispers. There were nights he curled in the yard and cried after bullets wrote his name on the air. There were mornings the cops booted doors and put red dots where his breath sat. He learned to watch first, move later. That saved him. The city built 2 doors for boys like him, ball or music. The Williams sisters chose a net. Aaron Aflalo chose a rim. Andre Young chose a board with faders instead. Kendrick chose paper. Middle school poems came back with A's when everyone else was drowning in C's. High school turned the scribbles into a map. Composition notebooks swelled with rhymes, loose leaf snowed under the bed. He studied Corrupt's bite, DMX's bark, Jay's chess, Eminem's contortions, Pac's sermon. At 16, he aimed the voice at beats he didn't even own and called it a mixtape. YHNIC. Hub City Threat, Minor of the Year. Bravado did most of the lifting. He was name-dropping cars he couldn't yet drive and movies he half remembered. The hunger was honest, the details not always. Promise lived under the mistakes. The internet turned that promise into signal. MySpace felt like the first block party with no cops. 2 dope boys, on Smash, Nah Right ran posts like radio stations that didn't sleep. File sharing broke the dam. Napster fell, LimeWire rose, torrents multiplied. A song could be everywhere and nowhere at once. K. Because that's what he called himself then, rode that current. Training Day followed in 2005. Swagger taped to borrowed beats and movie snippets, flashes of cleverness peeking through cliches. Then No Sleep Till NYC with J-Rock, testing his lungs against East Coast skeletons. Then C4, a Wayne salute where the flow finally snapped awake. On G-Code, the cadence started to sound like a spine instead of a trick. Stories crept in. Humor cracked the asphalt. He'd found a gear. The name change did the real damage. In 2009, He shed K-Dot like a stage prop and stepped out as Kendrick Lamar. The Kendrick Lamar EP didn't float. It walked in the room and introduced itself. Suddenly, the boasts had blood pressure. Is it love? P and P. Uncle Bobby and Jason Keaton. Faith. The song spoke in full sentences about family, God, grief, temptation. He let the listeners stand in the Food 4 Less parking lot, where salvation had a grandmother's voice. He admitted he didn't need the cosign he still wanted. He said he was broke and meant it. The masks didn't fit right anymore. The face did. If the EP was a front porch confession, Overly Dedicated was a floor plan. September 2010. Original beats this time, a theme running like a wire through the tracks. Addiction as gravity pulling bodies toward bad endings. Ignorance is bliss, wore K-Dot's old jacket on purpose. Guns, bravado. But the pen underneath had a different temperature. The rest came later. Cosigns and Pulitzers, presidential playlists, stadium chants that turned "all right" into a secular hymn. Before all that, there was a boy on someone's shoulders, eyes wide as a film set, absorbing a remix of his hometown into his bloodstream. There were parents who traded Chicago winters for California heat and slept in their car when the money broke. There was a teenager filling marble notebooks while his homies flirted with funerals. There was a name, first borrowed, then returned, then worn like truth. Call it fate. Call it craft. Call it what happens when a good kid learns to narrate a mad city without letting the madness swallow him whole. In the Reagan era, 1,000 small decisions conspired to build a voice that could carry a generation. Before the world argued about whether he was conscious, gangsta, preacher, or poet, he was just a watcher with a pen and a city that wouldn't stop talking. And the music. California sunshine poured into low ends and sine waves. Taught him how to make that talking rhyme. Chapter 2. Hood politics. They shackled him like a rumor they wished was true. Chains at his ankles, cuffs at his wrists, prison blues on his back, Kendrick Lamar shuffled into a cone of white light at the Staples Center, the crowd a dark ocean holding its breath. Behind him, a chain gang shadowed his steps. Drab uniforms, faces set like they'd already learned the verdict. He lifted his bound hands over the mic, sweat shining, eyes locked, the room turning into a courtroom that didn't belong to any judge. Biggest night in music, biggest pile of nominations of the year, cameras thirsty. He didn't smile. He pled the only case that mattered. "I'm the biggest hypocrite of 2015, he announced, detonating the line on cue. The sax cried to his left like a siren you can't outrun. Bars fell from his mouth like brickwork, the blacker the berry. Not as a single to sell, but as a charge sheet. Hair, nose, skin, rage, coded names for the same target. He knew who was watching. Not just the starched gowns and tuxedos in the seats, but the folks at home who'd learned to smirk through their teeth, who practiced politeness like camouflage. He didn't give them an exit. For once, prime time wasn't a soft landing. It was a hard truth with good lighting. Then the stage itself changed its story. The cuffs were gone. The light turned into fire. Drums and dancers kicked up dust that wasn't there a moment ago, and the air smelled like a memory the country forgot it owned. A camp blaze, bare feet, a pulse older than the building. He moved from cell block to circle, from American punishment to ancestral ceremony. And the song that followed had already started living a double life out in the streets. All right. By then you could hear it at marches from Oakland to Baltimore. A hook chanted like a spell. We gon' be all right, until the chant made the fear blink first. Awards would later attach themselves to the title like medals. But nobody inside that arena needed a trophy to confirm what the moment had already done. The music had stepped outside the broadcast and joined the people who needed it. He wasn't done. One last mic waited for him, and a song nobody knew yet. No comfort of a chorus you could hum, no radio familiarity to lean on. He slipped into a new voice, dry as chalk, and drew a diagram of the same old trap. Liquor for a lullaby, a gun as a mentor, the church as a building that sometimes echoes more than it answers. He whispered dates, Trayvon's, and by implication, all the rest, and wrapped the set in a mantra he'd been threading through his work. High power. 3 syllables that tried to raise a head before a hand. The last image hit like a stamp on a passport. The African continent glowing behind him. Compton carved across its heart in Gothic letters. A map that insulted borders. 2 homes, 1 silhouette. 6 minutes. Prison, protest, diaspora, industry, faith, doubt, and a thesis on the uses of a microphone, shoved into a time slot where people usually sell shine and shrug. By the break, the room stood. Legends clapped like peers. The host pitched to commercials with that little wobble you hear only when somebody's been actually moved. Later, think pieces would flood the timeline like weather. But what stuck was simpler. He'd taken an awards show and turned it into a mirror. History always shows up to argue, though, and Kendrick's politics never arrived in a neat suit with perfect notes. He came up after the first wave of militant rap had already punched the door in, after Public Enemy weaponized sampling into a wall of noise and names, after KRS-One posed with the rifle and the sermon, after brand new leather medallions swung where gold ropes used to. He missed the original march and inherited its echo. The blueprint that dug deepest into him wore Tupac's face, a paradox in boots, equal parts outlaw and altar call, cussing and praying in the same breath, squeezing empathy into places that swore they were empty. Pac made rage magnetic. He made it sexy to think. Kendrick followed that breadcrumb trail. Black Panthers in the liner notes, police brutality in the bars, a hood made visible without turning it into a zoo. Chapter 2. Hood Politics. They shackled him like a rumor they wished was true. Chains at his ankles, cuffs at his wrists, prison blues on his back, Kendrick Lamar shuffled into a cone of white light at the Staples Center, the crowd a dark ocean holding its breath. Behind him, a chain gang shadowed his steps. Drab uniforms, faces set like they'd already learned the verdict. He lifted his bound hands over the mic, sweat shining, eyes locked, the room turning into a courtroom that didn't belong to any judge. Biggest night in music, biggest pile of nominations of the year, cameras thirsty. He didn't smile. He pled the only case that mattered. "I'm the biggest hypocrite of 2015, he announced, detonating the line on cue. The sax cried to his left like a siren you can't outrun. Bars fell from his mouth like brickwork, the blacker the berry. Not as a single to sell, but as a charge sheet. Hair, nose, skin, rage, coded names for the same target. He knew who was watching. Not just the starched gowns and tuxedos in the seats, but the folks at home who'd learned to smirk through their teeth, who practiced politeness like camouflage. He didn't give them an exit. For once, prime time wasn't a soft landing. It was a hard truth with good lighting. Then the stage itself changed its story. The cuffs were gone. The light turned into fire. Drums and dancers kicked up dust that wasn't there a moment ago, and the air smelled like a memory the country forgot it owned. A camp blaze, bare feet, a pulse older than the building. He moved from cell block to circle, from American punishment to ancestral ceremony, and the song that followed had already started living a double life out in the streets. All right. By then you could hear it at marches from Oakland to Baltimore. A hook chanted like a spell. "We gon' be all right," until the chant made the fear blink first. Awards would later attach themselves to the title like medals. But nobody inside that arena needed a trophy to confirm what the moment had already done. The music had stepped outside the broadcast and joined the people who needed it. He wasn't done. One last mic waited for him, and a song nobody knew yet. No comfort of a chorus you could hum, no radio familiarity to lean on. He slipped into a new voice, dry as chalk, and drew a diagram of the same old trap. Liquor for a lullaby, a gun as a mentor, the church as a building that sometimes echoes more than it answers. He whispered dates, Trayvon's, and by implication, all the rest, and wrapped the set in a mantra he'd been threading through his work. High power. 3 syllables that tried to raise a head before a hand. The last image hit like a stamp on a passport. The African continent glowing behind him. Compton carved across its heart in Gothic letters. A map that insulted borders. 2 homes, 1 silhouette. 6 minutes. Prison, protest, diaspora, industry, faith, doubt, and a thesis on the uses of a microphone, shoved into a time slot where people usually sell shine and shrug. By the break, the room stood. Legends clapped like peers. The host pitched to commercials with that little wobble you hear only when somebody's been actually moved. Later, think pieces would flood the timeline like weather. But what stuck was simpler. He'd taken an award show and turned it into a mirror. History always shows up to argue, though, and Kendrick's politics never arrived in a neat suit with perfect notes. He came up after the first wave of militant rap had already punched the door in. After Public Enemy weaponized sampling into a wall of noise and names. After KRS-One posed with the rifle and the sermon. After brand new leather medallions swung where gold ropes used to. He missed the original march and inherited its echo. The blueprint that dug deepest into him wore Tupac's face. A paradox in boots, equal parts outlaw and altar call, cussing and praying in the same breath, squeezing empathy into places that swore they were empty. Pac made rage magnetic. He made it sexy to think. Kendrick followed that breadcrumb trail. Black Panthers in the liner notes, police brutality in the bars, a hood made visible without turning it into a zoo. Not every move made pretty friends. When a streaming giant tried to police hateful conduct by scrubbing certain artists from playlists, Kendrick's camp pushed back, arguing that corporations shouldn't get to be judge, jury, and DJ. Critics heard a defense of monsters where they wanted a defense of victims. The R. Kelly documentaries had broken the dam. Survivors' voices finally amplified enough to drown out decades of excuses. The moment asked the culture who it would stand with when it cost something. Silence can be strategy. It can also be an answer. That week, nobody in his circle rushed to explain. The same tension showed up with women's bodies, how he wrote about them, who he put behind the camera, which lines tried to uplift and landed like a lecture. He could write empathetically about a girl on the blade, trace the bruise beneath the makeup, aim tenderness where rap usually sharpens its teeth. Then he could pivot and say he's tired of airbrushing, that he wants to see stretch marks and natural hair, while still calling women bitch like punctuation. People heard the intent, pushed back on fake standards, and bristled at the posture. Another man deputizing himself to certify what was natural, replacing one gate with another. One of his earliest, most haunting videos was directed by a woman. The rest, mostly not. In a decade where women were not just muses, but generals, that imbalance glared. Call those contradictions or call them coordinates. Either way, a new word started floating around the discourse, Hotep. a tag that spits at a certain brand of nostalgia. Pro-black banners stitched to patriarchal scaffolding. Egyptology without politics. Conspiracy where analysis should be. People asked if Kendrick flirted with that orbit. The receipts looked partial at best. He favored Malcolm over Marx, self-discipline over academic treatises, brotherhood over bureaucracy. He loved a mirror more than a manifesto. He could be clumsy with gender while being laser with race. If that's a tendency, it's not a destination. It's a direction that can be corrected by better maps. What never wavered was the library he carried in his lungs. Malcolm X quotes threaded through old songs, speeches stitched as codas, names recited like prayers, Malcolm and Martin, Jesse and Jackie, JFK and Mike. On Mortal Man, he asked if we abandon our leaders when they become inconvenient, then measured devotion against the mess of being human. Love the art, ignore the damage? Forgive the man, forget the harm? No song answers that cleanly. The better ones refuse the bait and make you sit with the knot. He didn't do his thinking only on stages. There was that boat, Summit at Sea, a floating salon of founders and fixers, where a no-phones policy turned ideas into hush instead of headlines. He sat with Quentin Tarantino and a culture crowd, talking process like it was plumbing. It's not the equipment, it's the hands using it. A corny line in a different mouth. In his, a restatement of the whole ethos. The gear changes, the work doesn't. The city changes, the work doesn't. The country lurches right, left, mean, tired, the work shows up anyway. That's the frame you need to hang the Grammys night on. Not a flawless political treatise, but a living one. A kid who learned to watch before he moved. Now moving in front of millions, trying to braid together 1,000 urgencies without strangling the joy out of them. He will say the wrong thing. He will fix it or double down or go quiet, depending on which lesson the week is teaching. He will point inward when the moment demands outward, and vice versa, and learn the hard truth that the line between the two is a tripwire designed by people who benefit when you stumble. He will get crowned by the press and cursed by the timeline on the same afternoon and still clock in at the studio that night. If you want a single sentence to carry this chapter, it's this. In a country allergic to nuance, he insists on being complicated. Chain gang theater and Wakanda silhouettes on a TV stage. A protest hook that tastes like sugar and gunpowder. A closing line that bites the hand and the mirror in the same bar. A belief in God and a distrust of any building that claims exclusive rights to him. A soft spot for women in the lyrics and a blind spot in the credits. A refusal to keep naming a president who thrives on mention, and a pledge to act where the camera can't follow. A voice that raised a generation's pulse, and a pen that still trips on its own certainty. Chapter 3. Loyalty. He wore lime green like a dare. Meredith Hunter, barely grown, black silk shirt under that suit, brim casting a clean shadow over a badass fro. Eased a '65 Mustang onto the Altamont Speedway and thought the day would taste like Monterey had tasted. Sly's sunlight, Miles's midnight, everybody swaying the same direction. A free Rolling Stones set promised love without tickets, peace without walls. Instead, the Hells Angels rode the aisles like bouncers from a meaner world, Harley pipes snarling, pool cues swinging low. A young black man with a blonde girl on his arm is a target in any decade. In that one, it was a neon sign. He circled back to the trunk, lifted a long-barrel .22, not as a threat, but a shield. The kind a boy carries when he can't count on anyone else to guard him. The Stones hit Under My Thumb. Jagger shimmied, and Meredith climbed a speaker to see a little more sky. Fingers yanked his hair like a rope. Angel hands, ugly and sure, dragging him down into dirt and bad luck. 3 bikers closed in. He slipped into the crowd, meth jitters burned off by fear, and the fight-or-flight switch flipped both ways at once. The gun lifted, then wavered. His girl reached for his wrist and begged him not to. The knife found him first. 6 steel answers, quick and final, in front of a band, a camera, and a country that pretended innocence was a birthright. "I wasn't going to shoot you," he breathed, just before boots and a trash can and a verdict trampled the last of his day. The show staggered on. Loyalty to the crowd outweighed mercy for a kid. A jury later called it self-defense. Black life weighed light, same as it would decades later. Call him what he was, a black hippie. The kind who believed music might be a bridge wide enough to carry him home. Elsewhere, a boy who kept notebooks and bus transfers like talismans learned his tribe didn't have to look hard to be true. He stood in a downtown club when a tribe called Quest's first low-end rolled the floorboards, and it felt like someone had finally built a house for the soft-spoken, book-bag kids who loved James Brown breaks and comic strips in equal measure. Years later, he'd sit in a label office while Q-Tip and Allie explained a breakup into a speakerphone. And much later still, he'd be back in a studio when they found their way to one last album. In that final circle, a Compton kid named Kendrick slid onto Conrad Tokyo, fan and air at once. Back then, the native tongues taught a different physics. Jungle Brothers, De La Soul, Tribe. Dashikis and leather Africa medallions, peace and jokes, and a refusal to cosplay murder just to sell a hook. They were black hippies in spirit, if not in label, replacing menace with complexity, swapping brass knuckles for wordplay and joy. For the shy, skinny ones who didn't fit a corner, it meant survival. Hip-hop could hold laughter, tenderness, and a library card without losing its cool. Years later, Pharrell would set a modern teenage odyssey to film in Dope, Zoe Kravitz smiling like a door you might not earn, but you could at least knock on. Long before that, her mother, Denise Huxtable to the nation, had taught TV how a black girl could be free with a nose ring and thrift store gravity. Lenny Kravitz, once Romeo Blue, became the poster boy for a black boho gospel. Locks, tattoos, Led Zeppelin on the same shelf as Bob Marley. Lineage that said you could show up at a Stones concert and live to tell it. On a good day, black hippies were a neighborhood unto themselves. But Kendrick's world tilted west. If Death Row was the old cathedral, Top Dog Entertainment was a fresh-built chapel down the block. Same God, new sermon. And black hippie, Kendrick, J-Rock, Schoolboy Q, Ab Soul, wasn't a commune so much as a squad, 4 corners of the same map. Not Delas were complicated, not hard, exactly. These boys reserved the right to be both. Like a 21st century NWA without the uniform, they were a poster long before they were an album. A handful of posse cuts, Rolling Stone, Vice City, a dozen more, instead of a formal debut, and somehow that fit. The idea was the record. Watts gave the first voice. Johnny McKenzie Jr., J-Rock, grew up in Nickerson Gardens, 2 blocks from the spark that lit the '65 rebellion, where Jesse Jackson's "I Don't Know What This World Is Coming To" would one day echo again inside Public Enemy samples. Bounty Hunter Blood Country. Queensbridge had its gods, Marcy had its fables. Nickerson had cement courtyards and 1,000 red shirts. Injunctions told boys who they weren't allowed to stand beside. Cops kept a scoreboard. Top Dog found J-Rock on a porch under a barber's hands and said the thing that changes lives. Come to the studio. The year was 2005. K-Dot, young Kendrick, hovered in the back room, learning how to turn breath into angles. Mixtapes stacked up. A Warner deal arrived, then drowned in corporate turnover. Follow Me Home limped out through strange music, leaning on names Wayne, Rick Ross, Chris Brown, but built on Jay's voice, husky, steady, heavy with concrete. 2 weeks earlier, TDE had released Kendrick's Section .80. You could feel the tide shift in the same building. By 90,059, J-Rock wasn't playing only to the old West Coast script. There were diss tracks, blacked-out cover art, and the group cut that knocked hardest. Vice City. 4 friends passing the mic like a bottle. Then, on the night Kendrick set the Grammys on fire, a motorcycle broke J-Rock's body. He came back with Redemption, a title and a thesis, J. Cole and James Blake leaning in, King's Dead swinging its chains like jewelry and trapdoors. Obama put Wow Freestyle on a list. A Grammy landed. The man who survived had more to say than the boy who had something to prove. The last to join had started the club. Quincy Hanley, Schoolboy Q, was born in Wiesbaden to Army gravity, raised in Houston and South Central. 52 Hoover gangster Crip at 12. Honor student with a 3.3 before and after a 3-month bid. Football pads, OxyContin flips, and a brain that made bad ideas move smoother. He came to the House of Pain studio on a friend's nod, got tossed in a booth as a joke, and kept getting invited back. Black Hippie was the name he was toying with when Kendrick added the black. At first, Q hoped a group would let him hide. 1 verse, 3 killers to carry the rest. Instead, he became the member most likely to chase Kendrick up the charts. Setbacks, then Habits and Contradictions, then Oxymoron, his first best rap album Nod, landing with Party Smoke and Pain in the same bar. Roaches in the Cereal, Fig Street Curfews, prescriptions that turned to addictions, then turned back into songs. He could be clown, father, soldier in a single video. Bucket hat on a scowling toddler for the cover. Bikini butts and jokes in one clip, a numb stare in another. He dragged Portishead into South Central and made it make sense. Blank Face LP deepened the palette. E40 and Daz aging like oak, Anderson .Paak and Vince Staples snapping corners into focus. Even Kanye lent a hook. Mac Miller's death slowed him. Then Crash Talk let the light back in, less elegy than exhale. The man who'd formed a group to cover his flaws had become too big for anyone else's shadow. Herb Stevens, Ab Soul, was the mystery. Born in L.A., Germany as a preface, Carson as a home, a grandfather who ran record shops and pressed early L.A. rap when the city still doubted itself. A childhood spent at a counter ringing up CDs, watching the line long enough to understand how grief can sell out faster than joy. Eazy-E gone, Pac gone, the store humming with loss. Then a hospital bed and Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Skin peeling, eyes sealed, light turning cruel. He came back wearing shades and a new name, a mouth darker at the lip and quicker with riddles. Key styles on Black Planet, PlayStation beats from a cousin called Mark, soon to be Soundwave. Then the House of Pain's open door in 2006. Long-term mentality was a warm-up. The underdog taunted the mirror. Control System was the punchline. The Kabbalah tree on the cover, a Jesus fish repurposed as a logo, Conspiracy muttered over patient snares, SOPA and taxes and Bohemian Grove folded into bar work that actually bled. He took shots at Jay-Z, borrowed Drake's polish for a moment, and still sounded like nobody but Sulo. A Lori Joe's voice, his love, gone too soon, haunted the corners. The Book of Soul read like an open wound. Later he'd overthink it. These days, stretching thin, do what thou wilt. Wandering into Nibiru, Agartha, Crowley, a blizzard of names that couldn't all melt back into songs. But the pen stayed surgical. With a hit, the door would be there again. This is where loyalty shows its real shape. Not the internet kind, not the shirt you wear one tour and toss the next. Loyalty is the four of them tugging at the same rope from different angles, letting the other man's win read like a family receipt. It's J-Rock crashing and the crew closing ranks. It's Q joking his way through videos, but telling the truth on wax so his daughter will hear a man, not a myth. It's Ab-Soul walking into fluorescent studios with blackout shades and a head full of secret maps, and everyone else making room. It's Kendrick converting all that gravity into albums where track titles read like commandments: love, lust, fear, pride, loyalty. Then bringing the homies into the clean light with him, not as props, as proof. They weren't a group the way the old ones were. There was no Enter the 36 Chambers, no Beg for Mercy, no single project nailed to the decade. Crews hardly exist like that anymore. Ego tax is too steep, and streaming pays loners. Posses now are labels with a shared house sound and a rolling tour calendar. Still, something older lived in TDE, an understanding that solo glory feels hollow if the block can't celebrate with you. It's that death row gene spliced to Motown hustle, a business plan that lets the originators cash their own checks. Some nights, the past knocks with quiet knuckles. A familiar producer might swing by a familiar apartment in a dream, slide leftover sushi into an oven, wrong but loving, talk Dilla and drums, and then go crate digging through a hill of records for the perfect loop. Miles Davis's Honky Tonk winding up slow, the Stones' Monkey Man trilling its doorway open. The records hide. They always do when you need them. Morning comes. The dream evaporates, leaving only the feeling. That music is a house you keep finding new rooms in. That loyalty is carrying your people from one room to the next without dropping them. That Black Hippies and Black Hippie are two chapters in the same book about how to stay free together. By now there's a whole generation who got taller to these records, who learned to time their bus runs to mixtape drops, who kept Vice City in their back pocket like a lucky coin and All Right like a pulse. They know crews aren't forever. They also know families don't need contracts. The man from Compton, good kid, older now, keeps answering the same question with better words. What do you owe the ones who built your first stage? Everything you can carry. And when your arms get full, you ask the next brother to take a corner. That's loyalty. Not a pose, not a chain, not a chorus you shout once the camera points your way. It's J-Rock's hospital silence and triumphant horns 2 years later. It's Q turning a bucket hat into armor and then removing it at bedtime next to a sleeping child. It's Ab-Soul's black lip curving around grief and still forming syllables sharp enough to cut. It's Kendrick front-lighting all of it, then stepping aside so the spotlight doesn't burn holes. The music keeps count, even when no one else does. And somewhere out there, a boy in a lime suit still wants to watch a band and go home safe. Music can't fix what a blade decides, but it can teach a city how to stand shoulder to shoulder, how to risk for each other, how to make the next decade less cruel than the last. The dream ends like most of them do, half-remembered, warm, useless, and perfect. The work keeps going. Crews come and go. Loyalty stays when the speakers cut off. Chapter 4. All the Stars. There's a version of the world that never happened. One where the Bronx didn't have to fight for air, where hip-hop didn't crawl through basements and block parties just to be called real music. In that world, Run DMC wins Album of the Year, the same night Bruce Springsteen takes second place. Jesse Jackson dances at his own inauguration while Rakim and Roxanne Shante trade verses beside the presidential seal. Guns never steal Scott LaRock's breath. AIDS never kills Eazy-E. And the magazines, the glossy white Bibles that once ignored black sound, fight for cover rights to Grandmaster Flash, shot by Gordon Parks. But that was Earth too, a dream built out of what could have been. The rest of us lived in the crack smoke of the real 80s, where Reagan smiled on TV while South Central burned slow. In that version, Kendrick Lamar Duckworth was a baby, 2 years old when the decade turned and the lights dimmed. He didn't live the 80s. He inherited them. Born June '87, child of Section 8 and federal cheese, a boy raised on the aftershocks of broken promises. His mama, Paula, prayed over overdue bills. His pops, Kenny, carried Chicago hustle into Compton streets. The government called their neighborhood low income. The neighbors called it home. Section 8 meant 30% rent, 70% stress. Kendrick grew up where the walls hummed with sirens and the corners taught economics faster than any school. When he dropped Section 80, the title spoke for every child raised under that fluorescent buzz. The ones 10 times more broke, more bruised, more forgotten. It wasn't just about his block. It was a map of an entire generation born from Reagan's neglect and Bush's indifference. Crack babies, ADHD, church choirs with empty pews. He gathered them all inside his sound. But the politics hid between the snares. Kendrick never preached. He painted. And the paint was pain. By the time Section 80 arrived in July 2011, Kendrick was 24 and already old in spirit. Years of mixtapes had sharpened his pen. Hunger had shaped his patience. Then came the tweet, the one from Dr. Dre that shifted gravity. Everybody go download at Kendrick_Lamar's hashtag Section 80. The King of the West had just tapped a new prince. People like to call it luck, but Compton knows better. Luck don't show up unless you've been grinding in the dark for years. In Kansas City, in a Chili's, his engineer's phone buzzed. Dre wanted to meet the kid behind Ignorance is Bliss. That song, YouTube raw, grainy, true, had traveled farther than any industry handshake. Weeks later, Kendrick stood inside a studio that had birthed empires. Dre watched. The young MC rapped like every breath was collateral. You could feel history shifting its seat. Section 80 didn't sound like a debut. It sounded like a confession. Fuck your ethnicity opened the door with a sermon that burned down the color line. I don't give a fuck if you black, white, Asian, Hispanic. The message wasn't kumbaya. It was exhaustion. The kind that comes when the system keeps telling you what you are. He wasn't waving a flag. He was tearing it down. The record moved like a diary left open in a storm. Kush and Corinthians, No Makeup, Keisha's song. Each track a mirror held to the faces nobody photographs. Keisha, 17, raped and hustling her way through Long Beach nights, dies beneath streetlights that never blink. The story cuts deep because it's too familiar. Every city has its Keisha. Kendrick just gave her a name. The cover said it all. A Bible, a gun clip, condoms, weed, lipstick. Sin and salvation sharing the same desk. I'm not talking to the saved, he once said. I'm talking to the ones trying to find themselves. That's what made the album bleed with purpose. Not purity, but honesty. And then came High Power. 3 fingers in the air, a trinity of rebellion. Kendrick said the song came from a dream where Tupac spoke to him. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't let my music die. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was his mind talking back. Either way, the message stuck. High Power wasn't just a track. It was a philosophy. Huey, Malcolm, Garvey, Fred Hampton, all ghosts at the table. The Black Hippie Crew, J-Rock, Ab-Soul, Schoolboy Q, picked it up and ran with it. For a minute, hip-hop remembered it could still sound like a revolution. August 19th, 2011. The music box in L.A. smelled of weed and sweat and prophecy. Kendrick's set ended and suddenly Game, Corrupt, and Snoop stormed the stage. "You got the torch, nigga," Snoop said. "Run with that motherfucker." The crowd roared. Dre smiled from the VIP balcony. Kendrick cried. Not show tears, real ones. In that moment, Compton passed its crown, and the city exhaled. Then came the storm named Good Kid, M.A.A.d. City. The movie without cameras. A teenager rides through Compton, chasing love, dodging death, praying for redemption. Every skit, every voicemail, every prayer stitched together like a film reel soaked in blood and baptism. His parents' voices break the tension with humor, reminding you the hood ain't just danger. It's family, laughter, bad advice, domino games. The album opened with prayer and closed with Dre, the circle complete. Millions listened and heard their own city inside it. 2 years later, Grammy night. He lost every category, but it didn't matter. America finally knew his name. Swimming pools, Poetic Justice, Bitch Don't Kill My Vibe. Songs that made radio forget its own rules. He was everywhere. On tour with Kanye, on Big Sean's Control, throwing lyrical grenades at a dozen rappers in one verse. The world called it competition. He called it honesty. Then came the masterpiece. To Pimp a Butterfly, a record that sounded like the whole Black experience cracked open and set to jazz. Guilt, pride, fame, depression, Africa, America, all tangled together in brass and poetry. He carried survivor's guilt like a tattoo under his ribs. Friends dying while he toured Europe, his sister pregnant at 13, his conscience screaming through songs like You and All Right. The album wasn't just music. It was therapy broadcast on vinyl. When the Grammys crowned Taylor Swift instead, nobody in his world was surprised. Awards come slow to Black genius. But Butterfly didn't need a trophy. It already belonged to history. Still, Kendrick's story didn't stop at consciousness. He dipped into pop without drowning. Taylor Swift's Bad Blood, Imagine Dragons' Radioactive, Beyoncé's Freedom. Moves that could have cost him his credibility, but somehow didn't. Maybe because he never chased pop. Pop came knocking on his door. Even U2 came calling, asking for his voice. He turned their verse into 33 Point, a track about America's double vision, preaching peace while selling bullets. Then came DAMN, the sound of a man at war with himself and winning. No jazz, no orchestra, just raw heat, pulsing like a heartbeat under asphalt. And when the Pulitzer Board gave him that golden nod, the world stopped pretending hip-hop wasn't literature. The first rap album ever to win the prize. No Marvin, no Miles, no Stevie before him. Just Kendrick, the kid from Compton who wrote his way into history. They called it a virtuosic song collection unified by its authenticity. He called it Another Tuesday. He stood at Columbia University, clean suit, quiet smile, holding a certificate that once only poets and composers touched. Cameras flashed, but the look in his eyes said something else. Like he knew the moment wasn't about him alone. It was about every Section 8 kid who ever scribbled bars between gunshots, every dreamer told to tone it down, every voice that never made it past the block. That's what made it holy. Not the award, but the path. From Reagan's leftovers to a Pulitzer podium. From a Chili's phone call to Rolling Stone covers. From Keisha's alley to the White House lawn. All the stars didn't line up by chance. They burned their way into alignment. Chapter 5. The Spiteful Chant. The story of rivalry in music has always been older than the beats, older than the words. It's the quiet fire that turns artists into prophets and friends into ghosts. The Beatles once posed in their colored uniforms, standing in front of a garden made from their own graves, roses spelling out their name like a self-written obituary. Beside them, a doll wearing a Rolling Stone sweatshirt smiled, mocking and admiring at the same time. That little detail carried the spirit of competition, one band teasing the other, both knowing the game was the same, to be eternal. Every era needed that tension, that push and pull, because greatness never grew out of comfort. From Michelangelo glaring up at Leonardo's ceiling, to Brahms turning his nose at Wagner's orchestra, to Picasso and Braque pushing each other into Cubism's strange angles, rivalry was the oldest muse. Hip-hop was born from that same pulse, but it moved with bass and breath. The culture was competition made into rhythm. In the Bronx, in parks, in cafeteria corners, young voices rose not to share, but to conquer. I rhyme better than you. It was never just ego. It was survival. By the time Kendrick rose from Compton's dust, competition had become tradition. Every king needed a challenger, and every challenger needed a crown to reach for. On the other side of the border, in Toronto, a kid named Aubrey was building his own throne from heartbreak and hooks. Drake, the soft-spoken giant of radio waves, the confessional voice for the lonely and the loved, he didn't sound like the streets. He sounded like the rooms people cried in when the streets broke them. He was vulnerability made platinum. Drake's rise looked clean, acting, mixtapes, cosigns, and soon, domination. He became a pop star wearing the language of hip-hop, a hybrid that made purists twitch and the world sing. Women adored him. Men respected him, sometimes reluctantly. He turned self-pity into power, nostalgia into money. While he was counting streams, Kendrick was counting scars. And that's why the world couldn't resist the question: who would last longer, the poet or the pop star? When they met for the first time, there was no tension yet. Just two young men at the edge of something huge. Drake, already moving through fame like it was oxygen. Kendrick, still carrying the weight of Compton in his lungs. They connected quickly. Same age, same hunger, same quiet loneliness that fame can't fill. They laughed, shared music, and for a night in Toronto, it looked like brotherhood. Kendrick even played him early cuts of Section .80. Drake shared stories of the studio, of Wayne, of women, of pressure. But under that warmth was a whisper neither could ignore. Only one can be king. When Drake released Take Care, it painted heartbreak in high definition and sold like gospel. Kendrick's Section .80 was fire in a smaller circle, respected, discussed, but not yet worshipped. And for an artist like Kendrick, envy wasn't about jealousy. It was fuel. The industry loved the Drake formula: smooth, emotional, accessible. Kendrick's art was heavier, more dangerous. The difference between silk and steel. And that gap would define everything that came next. Their collaboration, Buried Alive, carried both prophecy and irony. Kendrick's verse read like a confession: fame as a drug, the music business as a seductress. He described killing his old self to fit the mold. It was both self-awareness and warning, a parable whispered between two men headed for very different heavens. Drake's world revolved around validation, Kendrick's around salvation. The lines blurred fast. Then came Good Kid, M.A.A.d City, a Compton diary written in blood and guilt, with beats that moved like muscle memory. It turned Kendrick from promise into profit. When Drake's Nothing Was the Same dropped, the charts screamed equality. Two giants walking different lanes, nodding across the freeway. The balance was fragile, though. Every empire needs friction to keep it burning. In 2013, a bomb dropped. Control. Kendrick's verse rolled through the culture like thunder. He didn't just call out names, he summoned ghosts. He told every rapper breathing that he wanted their heads, their fans, their legends. "I got love for you all," he said between syllables sharp as knives, "but I'm trying to murder you." It wasn't malice. It was the purest act of devotion to hip-hop's oldest law. Iron sharpens iron. The world went mad. Everyone with a microphone responded. 20, 30 rappers clawing for relevance, shouting replies into the void. Drake stayed mostly calm. "It's just ambition," he said later, smiling like someone who knows how to play chess better than the rest. But his next record carried a quiet venom. On the language, he rapped, "I don't know why they've been lying, but your shit is not that inspiring." He never said Kendrick's name. Didn't have to. Everyone heard it. The war wasn't declared. It was implied, coded, cold. Kendrick answered without speaking. Months later, at the BET Hip Hop Awards, the Top Dog crew took the stage for their cipher. J-Rock passed him the mic over the beat from Shook Ones, and the room turned to static. Kendrick grinned, leaned into the camera, and let it bleed. Nothing's been the same since they dropped control and tucked a sensitive rapper back in his pajama clothes. The crowd lost it. The line hit like a hammer to glass. Subtlety died that night. What followed wasn't war. It was something slower, stranger. A cold war fought through interviews, verses, and silence. Drake praised Kendrick in public, calling him a genius, a peer. But the compliments were sugar-coated barbs. Kendrick stayed distant, using metaphors like daggers. They were both too smart, too visible, to make it physical. The ghosts of Tupac and Biggie hovered over every stage they touched. Everyone remembered how that story ended. Time rolled forward. Awards, tours, milestones. Kendrick won the critics, Drake won the numbers. When To Pimp a Butterfly landed, it broke language itself. Jazz, funk, revolution, scripture. Meanwhile, Drake dropped If You're Reading This. It's too late, slick, commercial, calculated. One was meant for headphones, the other for headlines. Two planets orbiting the same sun. Then came whispers. Kendrick's King Kunta hinted again at ghostwriting. A rapper with a ghostwriter? What the fuck happened? It wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. Drake's empire depended on the illusion of honesty. And when Meek Mill later accused him outright of using ghostwriters, the rumor became reality. Kendrick didn't need to say a word. The truth echoed for him. Drake didn't strike back, not at Kendrick. He turned his aim to Meek, dropping 2 diss tracks that swept the culture like wildfire. Easy win. But everyone knew the unspoken rivalry that really mattered was still burning under the surface. Kendrick was climbing toward timelessness, collecting Pulitzers and reverence. Drake was stacking streams and memes, untouchable in a different kind of way. One preached substance, the other embodied success. Years passed, but the tension aged well. In 2014, when Kendrick dropped a verse on J-Rock's Pay For It, the line cut through, "Been dissecting your motor mouth till I break down the engine." It was a clean shot, masked as poetry. Drake had once called himself the kid with the motor mouth. Kendrick just dismantled the metaphor. Even their reconciliation seemed temporary. A handshake in public, a storm behind the curtain. Outside their world, the streets were bleeding again. Nipsey Hussle's death in L.A. reminded everyone how thin the line was between art and obituary. Extentacion, gone too soon. Too many names on t-shirts. The culture learned to replace bullets with bars, and subliminals became the safer war. The energy stayed dangerous, but now it was contained. Inside verses, not bodies. Kendrick and Drake both knew. Fame isn't armor, it's bait. By the time DAMN hit, the rivalry felt sacred. Drake couldn't out-rap Kendrick, and Kendrick couldn't outsell Drake. Each ruled their own kingdom, one spiritual, one commercial. Fans turned it into mythology, the prophet versus the player, the conscious versus the charm. But the truth was simpler. They needed each other. Like the Beatles needed the Stones, like light needs shadow. On the streets, kids argued in barbershops, in cars, on stoops. "Who's better?" one would shout. "Drake's got the hits." Yeah, but Kendrick got the message. It was more than fandom. It was identity. Choosing a side said something about what kind of person you were. Some prayed with Kendrick, others partied with Drake. Everyone listened to both. Years after Control, people still remember the feeling of that verse, that flash of danger, that arrogance that made hip-hop feel alive again. The two men who defined a decade never truly reconciled, never truly destroyed each other. They coexisted like rival gods on different altars. One gave the world anthems to dance through heartbreak. The other gave sermons to survive it. And through it all, the code of hip-hop stayed the same. A simple, stubborn creed whispered from the Bronx to Compton. I rhyme better than you. It wasn't hate. It was faith. It was the belief that words could still change who stood at the top. In the end, that's what the Spiteful chant really was. Not anger, not rivalry, but a hymn for the art of competition. Because somewhere out there, under a flickering streetlight, another kid is writing his first verse, already thinking the same thing. I could take them both. Chapter 6. DNA. He learned early that a city could split itself into tribes without drawing a single border. Uptown versus downtown, East Side watching West Side. Old heads at the stoop who swore the park jams were holier than any church, and young wolves who believed the algorithm lived closer to God. In one borough, they treated stoops like pulpits. In another, the benches by the river were confessionals. And yet the sermons sounded the same. This is ours, and no one loves it like we do. He carried that sermon south and west, across highways that cut neighborhoods into puzzle pieces nobody planned to finish, until the map finally said Compton, and the sun hit the street like a hot coin. The houses people rented had bars on the windows, even when nobody had anything worth stealing. Plastic lawn chairs kept a kind of order on the porch. Inside, the radio chose the day's temperature better than the weather did. Some mornings it was grief, sometimes gossip, sometimes God. Aunties ran the kitchen like a switchboard. Cousins moved through rooms like static. He learned names of neighborhoods like they were relatives. Rosecrans, Central, Wilmington. Learned to tell sirens apart the way some kids learn bird calls. Learned that the difference between a lullaby and a warning was mostly timing. His mother kept Old Soul on rotation, but it wasn't nostalgia for her. It was medicine. She wiped counters in slow circles to Marvin and hummed when the days got long, the way people hum to hold their breath together. His father had a cassette drawer that clacked open like a long joke. Inside were spines rubbed blank from being pressed and pulled since Reagan. Sometimes the old man would close his eyes at the kitchen table and beat time on the formica with 2 knuckles. and you could see the boy in him, who had once broken a broomstick to use as drumsticks. Nobody in that house ever said the word archives. But the drawer was exactly that. The kid learned more history between rewinds than he did from anything printed and stamped by the district. When his block started to change, it wasn't sudden. It was a slow scraping sound in the ear. Rent creeping. White folks jogging with dogs bigger than the rent increase, nodding hello while the old heads wondered how to pronounce whatever they were building down the street. Co-work, microbrew, live work. The store at the corner started stocking kombucha next to the malt. The pastor down the street preached the same 12 words in different orders. We are still here. We are still here. Nobody asked who he was, because everybody knew, and nobody knew. The first time he understood that music was a bloodline, not a job. He was 10 and nosy, standing in the hallway pretending not to eavesdrop. A cousin fresh home from county sat with his father and talked in that low, unspooling voice men use when they don't want to cry. Nothing about bars and courts. It was all about tape hiss and radio static. About songs that sounded like a hand on your shoulder when the whole room had turned its back. They traded names like contraband, choirs, horn sections, drummers who counted off like they were lighting matches. The boy felt the words creep under his skin and take root. He didn't know the language yet, but he recognized the hunger. He found out the neighborhood had a way of selecting who survived and who starred. The ones who rhymed in the parking lot every night weren't all poets. Some were just loud. The quiet ones kept notebooks that looked like they'd been bitten through, and you could tell which lines had been written outside the liquor store, because the ink bled where a drizzle hit the page. He saw how a verse could be a promise, and how a promise could be a prayer with no church to hold it. He learned to keep his mouth shut when somebody said they had an uncle who used to sing with somebody who used to play with somebody famous. Lineage, he understood, could be a myth you tell to inflate the air around you. But sometimes it was real. Sometimes the voice you carry is a voice you borrowed and paid back with interest. It was a girlfriend who taught him how to breathe when the beat wanted to take more than it gave. She worked nights at the clinic and knew all about compression, the kind that squeezes wounds closed, the kind that squeezes drums tight enough to punch through speakers. She told him to stop treating every verse like a sprint. Let the silence do some of the work, she said, sounding like a nurse and a producer at once. Stop trying to outrun your own lungs. He listened, and the spaces between words started to feel like alleys where whole lives could happen while you were catching your breath. The first real check bought studio time and a fridge that made ice, like magic. He watched the light on the preamp blink awake and thought of the sanctuary lights at church. When the choir leader clapped twice and raised her hands, he put on the headphones, and the room disappeared the way a city disappears at night from an airplane. Still there, but manageable. The engineer nodded. The red light insisted. The kid steadied himself, the microphone a small moon he decided to orbit without getting burned. He didn't arrive at the notion of a concept album because critics love concepts. He arrived there because the neighborhood itself insisted on continuity. The corner and the classroom, the liquor store and the laundromat, the rim shop and the rec center. These weren't vignettes. They were chapters. And the same characters walked through all of them in different clothes. If you told a story about a single day, it lasted a lifetime by the time you reached the final track. He built a record like a street, with left turns and dead ends, and that one block you know better than your own name. He threaded prayers through skits like wire through a fence. He let the drums argue with the bass the way people argue at a cookout. Too loud, too familiar, never truly finished. He discovered that a hook could be a machete clearing a path or a noose if you weren't careful. He learned to choose. When the first album took off past the trees and the streetlights, the old heads nodded like a verdict had been reached. The young ones posted videos from cars that still smelled like new plastic, rapping his words back to him with the windows down. He heard his own voice on a stranger's phone and felt both proud and counterfeit, like he'd been hired to play himself in a movie about his life. He drove alone that night, past the high school and the park. He parked by the chain link and listened to kids practicing crossovers under the lights. A boy laughed. A girl shouted. A whistle blew. He thought of the first time he'd leaned into a booth and said something only he had the nerve to say. He wondered who it belonged to now that everyone could sing it. The second album reached for more than a map. It wanted a mirror. Fame blurred the edges on everything. Friends, fears, God. He began writing like a man arguing with a judge only he could see. He recorded a verse at 4 a.m. that made the engineer spin his chair slowly and put his hand over his mouth. It wasn't the cleverness. It was the cost. He slept on the studio couch that night with his shoes on and his jacket over his face and dreamed of a boy running down a hallway that never ended. Fluorescent lights stuttering overhead. The boy wasn't him, but he was. And when he woke, he wrote about both. A city councilman brought him a plaque one spring afternoon and called him a local treasure, like he was a statue pigeons had blessed. Cameras flashed under a sky too bright to be trusted. He smiled and hoped nobody could see the sweat gathering under his collar. That morning, he'd driven his mother to the clinic and watched her hesitate at the door, as if the ground might give way between the parking lot and the waiting room. He put the plaque on a bookshelf between a photo of his parents and a book he meant to finish. The weight made the shelf tilt. He propped it up with a folded magazine and texted his girl that they needed a carpenter. She texted back a heart and a low, "Look at you." He felt like both the man and the boy he used to be, standing on a chair he wasn't sure could hold him. He started visiting schools without bringing a camera crew. The kids were mostly taller than he expected and mostly tired in a way adults never understand. He shook hands and asked names he wouldn't remember and told the truth. That a verse doesn't save you, that money doesn't cure fear, that some nights success is just a brighter kind of loneliness. He told them about the day his own fear changed shape. No longer a man in an alley, but a calendar. No longer a gunshot, but an email. They laughed when he said famous people still forget to pay parking tickets. He laughed too, and felt the choke loosen in his chest. On Sundays, he went to a church that met in a high school auditorium. Folding chairs, a projector screen, a cross made from 2x4s. The pastor wore sneakers and preached about Joseph the snitch and Peter the hothead, and Mary, who kept every strange thing in her heart, like a box of knives she'd learned to juggle. He loved the choir best when they missed a note and laughed and tried again. He loved the drummer who slowed on purpose to let an old woman finish her clap. After benediction, he stood by the donut table and heard small talk dressed up as survival. Who needed a job? Who needed a ride? Who needed forgiveness they couldn't ask for yet? He remembered a line he'd written about mercy, and how he'd cut it because it felt too easy. He decided to find it again. The argument about ghosts arrived, as it always does, right on time. Some old head in a podcast studio said he could hear too much of this one and not enough of that one, that the boy was all collage and no canvas. Another called him a prophet with a corporate sponsor and never blinked when he said it. People with microphones invented a new way to count, subtracting humanity by ones and twos until all that remained were metrics dressed up as truth. He tried to stay out of it. He failed. He wrote a verse that nobody heard because it didn't fit anything, because it wasn't a banger or a benediction, because it didn't flatter anyone, not even him. He kept it in the drawer where he kept other dangerous things. Spare keys, extra SIM cards. The note from his father with a handful of words he'd never seen in the old man's handwriting. I was wrong. I'm proud. When a young rapper from 6 blocks over got shot outside the taco spot, the street went quiet the way thunder quiets when it gets close enough to be personal. The boy had been loud and sweet and reckless. And the memorial took up the whole sidewalk. Candles sweating wax onto the concrete like the earth itself had started to melt. At the vigil, a woman he didn't know grabbed his sleeve and begged him to say something that would bring the kid back. He couldn't. He put his hand on her shoulder and said a prayer that felt like a lie until it didn't anymore. That night he went home and wrote, not to fix anything, not to win anything, but because not writing would have felt like letting the boy die twice. The world moved on, as it does. Headlines chewed and swallowed the tragedy and then asked for seconds somewhere else. He went back into the booth and read the verse from the drawer out loud and found it was finally ready to be heard. The drums on that track didn't punch, they pushed. The bass didn't swagger, it knelt. He let his voice crack where it needed to. He left a breath in the middle like a memorial. Nobody called it a single. He didn't care. What he inherited could be measured, if you were the type to make small things of sacred ones. A snare that says, hurry up. A bass line that says, be careful. A horn that says, we've been here this whole time. A choir that says, ask anyway. A story that says, stop pretending you weren't warned. He learned that lineage doesn't absolve you. It indicts you. If you carry their names in your mouth, you owe them more than covers and shout-outs. You owe them the risk they took, and then some. He called the album DNA because it wasn't only about blood. It was about choice. He set the needle down on a childhood memory and let it whirl. The opening track began with an argument he'd recorded in his mother's kitchen. Silverware clinking, someone laughing off camera. The kind of love that sounds like disagreement until you listen closer. Then the beat arrived on its heels, uninvited and undeniable, like a cousin who moves in and never pays rent. He rapped about a boy who watched a man fix a car with a borrowed socket wrench, then watched the same man fix a broken heart with 2 lines from a song and a quiet nod. He rapped about a girl who kept every receipt because her mother taught her to count promises the way you count cash. He rapped about a school where the best rapper was the janitor, and how he stopped to listen because respect is a muscle, and he was tired of letting it atrophy. Midway through, he did the bravest thing he knew how. He shut up. He gave the band 3 minutes to say what words couldn't. The drummer played the space between his childhood and his future. The keys found the chord that always shows up right before you decide to leave or stay. The bass tugged like a mother at a crosswalk. When he came back in, his voice was smaller, truer. He thanked the dead under his breath and didn't explain who they were. He didn't have to. By the time the last song faded, the argument in the kitchen resumed. And you could hear someone, maybe his aunt, maybe the neighbor, say, "Child, you ain't gotta be everything." The record clicked to silence like a door closing. He sat in the dark, headphones on, and listened to nothing with the same attention he'd given to everything else. He thought about the plaque leaning on the bookshelf, the shelf leaning on the magazine slowly sinking from the weight. He thought about buying a proper bracket and laughed at himself for thinking a bracket could fix what only balance could. Out on the porch, the night smelled like jasmine and dust. The block murmured the way a sleeping animal does, never fully at rest. Somewhere a couple was fighting softly. Somewhere a baby was announcing itself to the world, every hour on the hour. Somewhere a cop car slid by with its lights off and its windows down. He sat and let the air braid itself through his ribs. Across the street, a boy practiced a crossover until the ball turned slick and the backboard tapped tired applause into the dark. The boy missed, and then didn't. He went back inside and wrote one more verse nobody asked for. It wasn't clever. It wasn't clean. It didn't claim a crown or offer an answer. It did what the best prayers do. Told the truth and waited. When he finished, he closed the notebook and put it next to the cassette drawer that never learned to stay shut. He turned off the studio light and paused in the doorway like a man leaving a hospital room, relieved and wrecked at once. On the kitchen table, the old radio slept with its face glowing faintly, as if it had been listening the whole time and wanted him to know it. In the morning, kids would pedal past his house on bikes with one brake and no lights. Aunties would call to each other across driveways. The mail would bring good news on bills and bad news in big envelopes. The city would make its noise, and the music would answer. And the day would be a beat he recognized from childhood. Insist, insist, insist. He would sit down at the desk and try again, because that was the only honest inheritance worth keeping. The stubborn faith that a voice, properly risked, might keep somebody else from going under. That it might keep him afloat too. He didn't know if the record would win anything. He didn't know if the people with microphones would finally decide what he was. He did know this. When he pressed play, the house felt less haunted. The drawer stayed closed for once, and the argument in the kitchen ended with laughter that sounded like permission. Chapter 7. M.A.A.d. City. They met on a night that smelled like warm Hennessy and floor wax, the kind of Brooklyn red light bulb twisted into a Compton ceiling that made sweat look like lacquer and bodies move like they'd been waiting all week to be forgiven. The rented speakers trembled in their cardboard shells, the bass loping through the living room where a couch leaned like it owed rent. Shireen had that walk you notice before you notice anything else. A slow clock in the hips, a shrug that said she'd already seen what the world had to offer and would accept only the parts that glittered. He told her his government name like he'd stolen it. Quiet, eyes level. And she tasted the syllables, cracked her gum, said something flirty that made him laugh with his mouth closed, because boys from where he's from don't show teeth around strangers. Outside, El Segundo bled into night. Inside, somebody's cousin kept rewinding the same song, the floorboards practicing an earthquake. It was summer heat stubborn in October, the kind that made cheap cologne fight for air with Marlboro breath and fried wings in a foil pan. If you squinted, you could see the old men of the neighborhood standing in the next room, not there in flesh, but in sound. Spades slapping a folding table somewhere in memory. A father's shout riding a domino bone to triumph. He took her number off a flip phone screen, as if he were signing for a package. Say less. We'll see. And he went home with the image of her burned under his eyelids like he'd stared at the sun on purpose. There are kids who take the street like a dare, and kids who take it like a test. He was the latter, pencil behind the ear, always calculating what could go wrong. But calculation melts under certain lights. Weeks passed. Text messages chirping on school nights, whispers with the phone pressed to an ear so warm it creased. She lived with a grandmother who carried her anger like another cardigan, and two brothers who ran the hallways like a prison yard. The mother was a rumor of a woman with a habit that carved tunnels through faces. The cousin, Demetrius, had a reputation that traveled ahead of him like a low siren. None of this made the boy back away. It sharpened the whole thing. The city has a way of turning warnings into perfume. Days tumbled like dryer change. He hooped at Gonzales Park, shoes coughing dust, laughter skidding off the backboard, the heat sitting on shoulders with both hands. After the last shot, everybody smelled like they'd fought the ocean. The Toyota's door panels rattled. Somebody's burned CD clicked into gear and turned the cabin into a small, bad cathedral. From the back seat, he chased words up a beat just to feel them run, the way some kids chase stray dogs because they want to know if kindness is faster than teeth. He bragged about money he didn't have, women he hadn't met, power he'd never touch. The others hooted because this is how boys build shields, by pretending steel is cheap. Peer pressure wears the plainest clothes. Come on. That's all it took. Come on. The freeway's sodium lamps fell on their faces as if blessing or accusation. Who can tell? They slid past Westchester High, where girls looked like promise and boys looked like scholarships. Kicked the corner at a speed that made mothers in unmarked cars lift a prayer to their throats. Found their way into a respectable zip code where backyards were big enough to host a lie. They'd watched the house 2 months. Trash day, routines, how long it took a porch light to give up. The boy had never felt this particular arrangement of terror and joy, a knot that felt like it belonged to some other species that nevertheless spoke his language. The front door buckled. The house sighed, full of someone else's choice. They peeled it down to drawers and jewel boxes and a safe that looked like the word no. It is not easy the first time to put your hands inside a stranger's quiet. He did it anyway because he had friends who already had. And because sometimes you move with a crowd the way a leaf moves with floodwater. A phone vibrated in his pocket. Mama calling to ask about the van he'd sworn to bring right back. 15 minutes tops. Baby, I just need to get to the county building tomorrow for the card. In the living room, a television muttered in its sleep. He blew out a breath and tried to laugh. One of the boys passed him a blunt that hit like a door frame to the forehead. Wet plastic. A too sweet perfume. Sherm. He didn't know until the carpet leaned, until the walls pulled back like they'd been tied to trucks, until the kitchen tile turned into a chessboard where he was always the pawn. They made it out sideways. Sirens were the neighborhood's house band. They knew the cues. The Toyota coughed to life and took them down a block where a woman watered her patch of lawn like it was a holy thing. After, under the apartment carport where oil stains looked like maps of countries they'd never see. They laughed the shaky laugh boys use when they're not sure if they're alive or auditioning for it. He told himself never again. He meant it in the way people mean it when a promise is just a handrail for a dizzy room. Back in his bedroom, the fan whirred, a low helicopter that never landed. He lay on the mattress, eyes sore, the city's hum pooling in the corners. He texted Shireen because the body keeps simpler calendars than the conscience. Her replies came dotted with ellipses, as if she were tugging something toward yes. The plan snapped together in his head. Grab Mom's purple van, ride out, 2 hands on a wheel that smelled like coconut oil and old church. It was twilight when he merged with traffic. A molten line of brake lights that looked like rosary beads dragged across an avenue. He rehearsed the story he'd tell if he got pulled over. He ran his tongue over a molar he'd cracked once in a fight he hadn't wanted, tasted the metal the mind makes when it shops for doubt. Where he parked, the street leaned toward shadow. 2 figures unpeeled from the dark like it was a coat. Hoodies up, hands quiet. The air went thin. He recognized the choreography, how a threat enters a circle and immediately turns it into a mirror. They asked who he belonged to. He told them he belonged to home. They asked who told him he could come down there. He didn't say her name because some names are flint. The first hit was not a punch. It was a signature. He watched his own legs fold in a polite collapse. He tasted pennies. The asphalt cupped his cheek like a neighbor who disapproved of his choices. When the world righted itself, the 2 were walking away, with his pride in a bag. He didn't think he saw her watching from a window. He told himself a story where she didn't know. Because sometimes survival is the art of forgery. He rolled home like a man piloting a damaged appliance. His boys poured into the van before the engine sighed off, faces lit with the terrible mercy called loyalty. They saw the split lip, the swollen eye, the humiliation blooming under his skin like a flood behind a dam. They wanted a correction. Revenge is a word the neighborhood pronounces without vowels. The liquor store's fluorescent gleam stitched them together for the next part. Bottles swung like arguments. The freeway rushed them into a tunnel that sounded like their father's tempers. Somewhere, a gun waited with the patience of furniture. Here is the part the city insists on repeating until you can recite it backward. Somebody's cousin's brother, Dave, who laughed like a radio and sang like a steering wheel drummer, was there because he was always there. The boys forgot to be scared for a minute. Tires squealed, joy yelling, that raw, stupid energy that pretends to be immortality. Shots were no louder than disrespect. They entered the van like questions asked by a god who wasn't listening. Dave caught one, or it caught him. What's the difference? The laughter cut off the way a DJ kills the record mid-scratch. You don't hear the scream, not really. You hear the silent scramble for purchase. They built a pile of hands on his chest that could not teach blood new tricks. He died fast in a slow way, which is to say, there was time enough for them to imagine a different world and hate it for not arriving. Grief sat them in a parking lot behind a supermarket whose air vents breathed like beasts. An older woman appeared the way older women appear. The city keeps them folded in glove compartments for nights like this. She spoke into them like a faucet turned on, her voice thick with a faith that had survived cheaper catastrophes than theirs. She made them bow their heads. They hated the posture because it resembled surrender. He said the words with his mouth, and for a second believed his own breath might carry them somewhere. That maybe a prayer wasn't a rope thrown down a well, but a rope thrown up, into air that had decided to be kind. That night he dreamed in fragments. A hand knocking over dominoes, not in anger, but ceremony. A woman's laugh, and how it sounded just before it grew bored. A crowded church where songs smelled like hair grease and peppermint. In the morning he woke with his mind set like concrete, on music, on a kind of speech that could hold this all in one body without breaking it, the way a mother can carry groceries and gossip and grief up a stairwell without dropping a single bag. People say the city turns boys into wolves. Sometimes it turns them into archivists. He began to keep notes nobody could see. The exact slant of light on Rosecrans at 6, the way a mother's voicemail softens even while it scolds, the scrape in his father's voice when the game runs long and the beer runs out. How shame tastes, like pennies and old rain. He scribed tricks of structure, how stories could loop back on themselves like the river of a snake eating its own tail. How beginnings could be endings replayed at lower volume. How each character could wear a mask at first, and then at last their own face. He thought about Shireen more than he admitted, because desire is the city's quietest engine. He couldn't decide if she had arranged his humiliation or simply stood too close to its inevitability. He rewrote her sometimes with kinder ink. A girl who wanted escape for herself and accidentally betrayed his. He rewrote himself as somebody who didn't mistake curves for safety. Each draft argued with the last. In time, he learned there are only two genres here: the story where you survive the night, and the story somebody else must tell for you. The van came back to the house with its new dents already telling on him. His mother's message unfurled in his pocket the way flags used to, weary and insistent. You said 15 minutes. I need that van for the county. Your little siblings are looking at me like I can cook disappointment. In the background, His father shouted about dominoes, as if the bones themselves had asked for him and been disrespected. In the next message, her voice was softer, not because forgiveness had arrived, but because love had. And it always brings a chair. Baby, call me back. And then the last one, their voices together, stitched in a way that made him feel both smaller and larger. His father talked about what real meant, how killing a man proved you were capable of ending something anybody could end, while feeding your people proved you could keep something alive. His mother told him word had reached her about that parking lot prayer and that God took any hand willing to be held. This is where the meta lives. And not just as commentary, but as breath. The boy in the room, body sore, mind new, deciding to build a device that could carry all of this. The lust and the laughter and the robbery and the beating and the bullet and the prayer and the scolding and the father's bone-sharp wisdom and the way the city always tries to measure a boy for a coffin. He wanted to tell it crooked, because that's how it happened. Because honesty sometimes requires a jagged edge. He wanted the opening to be a woman's voice demanding a van, because nothing says childhood like a chore undone. He wanted the ending to be a victory lap that sounded like a city forgiving itself for a minute. A studio air thick with legacy, the Dr. Elder nodding to the student, both of them from the soil that had tried to starve them and failed. He could see it laid out like blocks on a planner. The party, the car, the break-in, the crash of a high, the house of a girl who looked like a promise wrapped in hazard tape. The fists, the gun, the death, the prayer, the rebirth, the phone calls binding the whole sprawl with maternal thread. He'd seed it with names that meant more if you were local and still meant enough if you weren't. He'd lace it with details fat enough to fool memory into thinking it was standing there. Orange soda sweating in a convenience store light. The silk of a do-rag at midnight. The way a cracked windshield keeps spidering out even if you leave it alone. And the narrator, this voice overhead like streetlight, wouldn't pretend objectivity. It would admit how the boy's choices felt familiar. Say softly that making art out of all this isn't an escape route so much as a mirror angled toward the place you least want to see. It would confess that part of the magic is administrative, to stack scenes until they become a city, to make time obey by refusing to walk straight. It would argue that hip-hop has always been a library with a turntable for a door, and that some records aren't just albums, but neighborhoods. And some verses aren't just bars, but stairwells. And some hooks aren't just choruses, but cousins calling you inside before the streetlight snaps on. He drove south the next morning with cereal dust on his tongue and the van's dashboard stuttering a check engine light like a Morse code prayer. The neighborhood unwound around him. Liquor stores with sun-faded posters promising jackpots. Churches with marquee letters pleading for a better headline. Hair-braiding signs that were really invitations to sit and be held for 3 hours while somebody made order out of a mess. Carson shimmered ahead like a suggestion. The studio door would be heavy and perfect. And on the other side of it, he would find the exact air he'd been imagining. The kind that vibrates at a pitch you can only hear if you've already lost something. There is a version of this story where he never writes it down, where the robbery becomes another notch on the block's belt, where Dave is a mural that peels, where Shireen becomes 3 different girls in 3 different songs, in 3 different boys' cars. There is a version where the prayer doesn't take, where peer pressure keeps its hand on the back of his neck. But this is the version where the city doesn't get the last word. This is the version where the narrator refuses to watch another boy dissolve. This is the version where the van returns. The voicemail ends with, "I love you," said twice. Once to make sure he hears it, once to make sure he feels it. And the chapter closes on a hood that is still mad, still hungry, still gorgeous in its ruin. while a kid from its blocks steps into a booth and teaches the room how to hold its breath. He didn't know yet about prizes that sound like old newspapers, or syllables engraved on glass, or a stage where cameras sit like crows. He only knew the feeling of a pen becoming a key. He knew Compton would always live in his elbows and spine, in the way he takes corners, in the music he makes when he's alone. He knew the city had called him a statistic and then dared him to contradict it. He planned to answer in 12 tracks and a heartbeat, with skits like landings, with a structure that could carry grief like a hidden pocket. If anyone asked what genre it was, he'd shrug. Around here, the only genre is survival. And the only meter that matters is whether you can walk back through your own front door. The chapter ends how the album will. A drive-by victory, windows down, ghosts in the passenger seat turning down the radio just to hear him breathe. The narrator watches him go and chooses not to follow, because the boy has more to gather. But we stay with the street he leaves behind. The hair salon sign clacking in a stubborn breeze, the old man sweeping his storefront as if cleanliness could defeat despair. The little kids jumping a rope whose slap keeps time like a hi-hat. For a moment the day holds still, balanced on a story whose order never was straight. And maybe that's the point. In a city mad enough to rename you, narrative is not a map. It's a hand you can grab when the light changes and you need to cross. In the end, this isn't just about Kendrick. It's about every kid who ever stood at the edge of their block, hearing two worlds pull at them, the dream and the dirt. It's about turning pain into poetry and silence into sound, because what Kendrick showed us is simple, but sacred. Greatness doesn't come from leaving the hood. It comes from listening to it. His story isn't a myth. It's a mirror. A reminder that art can be both a weapon and a prayer. That a microphone can weigh the same as a cross. And that every verse written in truth is another chance to make peace with where you came from. So when the lights fade and the beat stops, remember this. The city's still talking. And if you're quiet long enough, you'll hear it too. If you felt that story, if it hits somewhere real, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Tell us which chapter spoke to you the most. This is Street Legends, where hip-hop breathes, stories live, and truth never dies. See you in the next one.